distinguished members of the panel and on the board, on the podium, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you very much, SKOCH, for inviting me to be a panelist today. I should mention that when I was an undergraduate student here in St. Stephen's College, we used to hear about a person who had been a legendary debater, and that was none other than Mr. N.K. Singh, who had already passed out a few years before I got there. So to be on a panel with him and to speak immediately after him, I must say, is quite a daunting challenge. Fortunately, I think on most things, he has made a brilliant presentation, I thought, and I happen to be on the same page as him. So it is not that daunting after all. Let me now come to the subject hand, and perhaps in some way it will address the question Anup you raised. There is a context in which, again, this question of the architecture of fiscal federalism in this country has got a lot of attention, and there have been a few key developments which impinge on this architecture. The first one, of course, is the introduction of the goods and services tax, and which is now supervised and monitored and implemented by the GST Council, which brings about a whole different quality of relationship, because that council is headed by the finance minister, but its members are all the finance ministers of different states. It's made a very big change. Second development was, of course, the abolition of the Planning Commission and eventually even the removal of the distinction between planned and non-planned finance. This is a subject on which Mr. Singh did speak at some length. But again, this affected the structure of our fiscal federal relationship because, as you will recall, the Planning Commission was at its apex. There was the National Development Council headed by the Prime Minister, which in that old form does not exist anymore. Third, there was the award of the 14th Finance Commission, which Anup was referring to. Since I was a member, I should take a few minutes to explain what it had done. There is a certain amount of revenues, what is known as the shareable pool, which is shared between the center and the states. This does not include some items of revenue like cesses and surcharges, but all taxes are included there. Now, progressively from one finance commission to the next, the share of what goes to the states has been incrementally going up. Under the 13th Finance Commission, it had been raised to 32% of the shareable pool. The 14th Finance Commission very substantially raised this to 42%. But I should also emphasize that while the total of the shareable pool that was devolved was raised to 42%, the share of the shareable pool itself was actually not raised at all by the 14th Finance Commission. In fact, at that time, it had been about 61 or 62% during the period of the 13th Finance Commission, and during the 14th Finance Commission, it became something like 63% of the total shareable pool. But as I said, the devolved part, the devolution part, was raised from 32 to 42%. That was a big change. There was a lot of misunderstanding that as if the total amount of the shareable pool that was being given to the states was being raised. Actually, what was raised was just the untied part, the devolution part, because that is just given as a share of taxes to the states, and they do what they want with it. But while not raising the total fiscal space of the states, it certainly raised their autonomy, their power to decide what to do with that fiscal space, and in that sense, it was indeed a significant change. The next big development, and this is again something Anup referred to, were the terms of reference of the 14th Finance Commission, including the amendments, 2 amendments that have come subsequently. Rightly or wrongly, a number of states felt that this was the beginning of an intrusion to reduce the autonomy of the states. And I must emphasize here that Mr. Modi, then as Chief Minister of Gujarat, had been one of the leading proponents of increasing the powers of the states in federal fiscal relations, as in fact is mentioned in SKOCH's sort of background document. Whether his view on this has changed in his new vantage position as Prime Minister or not, I do not know. It can happen because you see things from a different perspective. So that was there, and some of these states felt that their fiscal space was going to be eroded. Some states got together and formed, not an association, but they had some seminars and so forth. So that has also created some concern, and also the amendments that followed. So this is the context in which we are today again talking about federal fiscal relations. Let me start by making first of all, in passing, I don't know whether I'll have time to come back to it, that when we talk about federal fiscal relations, there are actually 2 parts to it. There's a relation between the center and the states, which gets most of the attention, but there's also the relationship between the state governments and the third tier of government, namely the Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies. And this very often is largely neglected. If I have time, I'll come back to it, but let me put that aside for the moment and talk mainly about the relation between center and states. Now, what that amendment suggested, the first amendment, was to carve out something from the devolution share for defense and security purposes. And it was seen as this was taking away fiscal space of the states. Now, while defense is a national subject indeed in terms of the distribution of subjects in Schedule 7 that Mr. Singh was referring to, internal security is certainly partly a responsibility of the states. And in that sense, a part of what is their fiscal space has always been and continues to be devoted to internal security. Now, so if a part of this is replaced by the center taking that over, maybe the fiscal space is not reduced, only the autonomy is being reduced in the sense that now the center decides how, say, the state police and so on are to be assigned as part of their tasks are to be assigned as a central decision rather than that of the states. But their fiscal space, which was being used earlier for this purpose, will still be used for that purpose. And that's just a little clarification I wanted to make. And it's important to make this point because, this, in a sense, the same thing applies to the centrally sponsored schemes to which Mr. Singh referred at great length and described extremely well what this does. Since these are tied, shared responsibilities, the center gives some money, the states give the rest. So being part of that means it also ties up a part of the fiscal space of the states for programs which are actually decided by the center, and there's a huge proliferation of them. They are, in fact, a major source of fiscal transfers apart from Finance Commission awards, and this has become a very contentious issue. So with these thoughts in the background, there are different options of how to restructure federal fiscal relations which have been talked about, and I will quickly go over them. The first one, and which is something that a number of states have been saying for quite some time, and that has to do with the fact that, look, whatever it is that you decide to give us, whether it is 40% or 50% or 62%, as is the case, give us the whole amount as a devolution, and then let us decide what we will do with it. You don't tell us how much of it is to be used for some other purposes. Now, I think this is an unrealistic demand of the states for the simple reason that there are a number of things that the states deal with which have spillover effects beyond the borders of the state. Whether it is you talk about health or even education and so on, a number of these things, certainly environment protection issues, pollution issues. So therefore, they cannot just be left to the states, and they have to be also addressed by the center. A second aspect, which is often forgotten, is that while the states may be demanding that it be left to them to design their own schemes and policies and so forth, and they just be given a total amount as untied amount, this may be fine for the more advanced, better off, high capability states, because they can indeed design their own programs and so on. But there are weaker states. I don't want to identify them, but you know that there are a lot of these states which are sort of lower down in the ordering of the advancement of states and their capabilities, who are actually not in a position always to design these programs. And they often say that it helps us if there's a centrally sponsored scheme under which there's a central design which comes to us. So there are two sides of that argument. Second option, which has also been proposed, is that even though the Planning Commission was abolished, there are certain tasks of planning which remain. And therefore, we now have a missing institution. And different suggestions have been made of how this can be changed. One suggestion is that I don't know what Mr. Singh will think about this, but one suggestion is that the Finance Commission be made into a permanent body, which was never made, even though it's a constitutional body, and a body which is not actual constitutional body, like the Planning Commission was a permanent body. So that was an anomaly which has now been partially corrected. You can go a step further, make the Finance Commission a permanent body, and since there are no distinctions now between plan and non-plan subjects, and the Finance Commission looks after the total finances and allocation, it can also look beyond short-term allocations to long-term allocation for planning purposes. So that would be another way to go about it. But this would mean actually a further erosion of the autonomy of the states, because right now what is being decided with the states would then be decided by the Finance Commission. And while the Finance Commission is not a body of the central government, it is a federal body which is, as it were, a referee between the center and the states. It is nevertheless a decision which is not the states. So this would be a decision-making power which would move away from the states, so it would obviously not be very popular with them. But there's a third option, and that is my preferred option, which is to empower a body that already exists, that is the Interstates Council. Now, this is a constitutional body that exists. Unfortunately, it has never been used properly. It is parked inside the Home Ministry, which is very peculiar for a Home Ministry of central government, which is a very peculiar thing to do for what is supposed to be a federal body. But that can be reinvented, can be restructured as a genuinely powerful body, more or less modeled along the lines of the GST Council, except that in this case, the chair would be the Prime Minister, not the Finance Minister, and you would have the Chief Ministers as its members. And they would be making decisions on things like programs that are currently being supported by these centrally sponsored schemes and so on, which Mr. Singh talked about at great length. And given the experience that we've had with the GST Council, it is certainly the most effective federal institution of cooperative federalism that we've had so far. I think that's a good model to think about. And let me say in passing, and in fact endorse what Mr. Singh already said, that the GST, the way it has been rolled out, is one of the main reasons why there's a huge shortfall in revenues today, and that is causing a lot of stress in our macroeconomic management, and partly responsible for the decline in growth rates and so forth, which I'm not going into now. But it is important to recognize that it is only because it was rolled out without proper preparation, impact of the GSTN and so on, which is at the core of it. But this should not be taken as implying that the tax itself is something that is not good. In fact, it's an excellent tax, and I hope we will quickly get our act together to reform the way that tax is being administered. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.